Hello and welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. The USA locks up more migrants in its immigration detention facilities than any other country in the world. Already operating well over capacity, the Trump administration has, in recent weeks, ramped up its campaign of immigration raids, allegedly instructing ICE to hit quotas of 3,000 arrests per day. It's a strategy that is both cruel and chaotic, not to mention incredibly costly. Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, which has recently passed through Congress, would, if approved by the Senate, appropriate tens of billions of additional dollars for ICE and immigration border law enforcement more broadly. Without the facilities to house these detainees, many thousands now face the prospect of being removed to Guantanamo or else placed in new soft-sided facilities where already inadequate guidelines for detainee welfare will be watered down further in order to facilitate their creation. In June 2025, Pluto published the new book, Immigration Detention Inc, The Big Business of Locking Up Migrants, by Nancy Hiemstra and Deirdre Conlon. An incredibly useful contextualizing resource in the current moment, the book provides a damning expose of the ways in which immigration detention generates huge profits for some, while detainees are starved, sickened, and exploited as a matter of routine. It's a privilege to be joined on the show today by Nancy and Deirdre for a conversation about the book, about the ways in which immigration detention has expanded in 2025 under Trump, and the ways in which it might be resisted and ultimately dismantled. As ever, podcast listeners can get 40% off the book through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Okay, without further ado, this is Nancy Heamstra and Deirdre Conlon on Radicals in Conversation. Deirdre and Nancy, I'd like to welcome you both to Radicals in Conversation. It's really lovely to get to sit down with the two of you and talk a little bit about your new book, Immigration Detention Inc, The Big Business of Locking Up Migrants. That is, at the time of recording, out in, I think, 3 days' time officially. And although I guess you finished writing the book at the start of the year, it feels incredibly relevant to the present moment. So we'll get on to talk about that in a little bit. But perhaps firstly, you could just start by introducing yourselves briefly for our listeners and our viewers. And then maybe we'll talk a bit about the genesis of the project. So Deirdre, could you just say a little bit about yourself first?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. It's great to chat with you. My name is Deirdre Conlon, and I'm based at the University of Leeds in the UK. I did my PhD in the United States, and I've been working on immigration detention issues for well on a decade and a half, I would say, at this point.
Yeah, I'm Nancy Hiemstra, and thanks so much for having this conversation with us, Chris. I am an associate professor at Stony Brook University in Long Island in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and I'm a political geographer by training. And like Deirdre, I've been working on issues of detention and deportation for quite some time now, since I started my dissertation, in around 2007, so for quite some time.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so then let's talk about the genesis of this particular project, right? There's clearly this huge sort of wealth of research that's gone into the book. Anyone that picks it up will see that immediately. So you've both been dealing with this subject matter for a long time, but yeah, what was the genesis of this particular project, working together on this? What prompted you to research and to write the book?
Well, I mean, we have been working together on this project since really 2012, when Deirdre was still in the U.S., and we had been working separately on things to do with detention and deportation, and started working together and we decided to look at detention facilities in the greater New York City area, just kind of asking questions of like, well, who is really making money here? And so since 2012, we've been regularly collecting documents on the facilities in our study and analyzing them. And for years, we have published in academic venues, but as we've been doing this, detention has only grown. And so it's frustrating that while we are seeing very clearly that this is detention is very profit-driven, and the investment in detention and the widespread belief that detention is an effective immigration enforcement strategy, While that is very much out there, we see that it's so much driven by profit. So kind of motivated by hoping to get more of that message out, we decided to write a book more directed at a general audience instead of kind of a narrow academic audience.
Yeah, brilliant. I suppose you write in the introduction to the book that it has these kind of two primary goals: to reveal the lived consequences for people who are caught up in, what you call Immigration Detention Inc. And then secondly, to show this kind of the depth of financial dependence on depriving immigrants of their freedom, that actually like the whole of the US is entangled in this web of dependency on detention. I think that's one of the real interesting things that comes through in the book. So hopefully we'll talk about both sides of that equation, and then we'll go on to talk about what's happening right now with regards to sort of immigration enforcement and detention. Because I think the book's an incredibly useful tool for anyone trying to contextualize like what they're seeing in the news and so on. And obviously we'll hopefully go on to talk a little bit about the ways that immigration detention can be resisted and ultimately perhaps dismantled as well, because that's another sort of, aspiration of your research in the book. Maybe it makes sense then to start by talking a bit about the history, right? The history of immigration detention in the USA. I think people know that the US sort of jails more people in its kind of carceral system than any other country as a proportion of its population or something. And it probably will come as no surprise that it also has the world's largest system for incarcerating migrants. So how have we got here, essentially? How has what you refer to as Immigration Detention Inc. grown so dramatically in recent decades?
As kind of patterns of immigration were changing in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s to be more diverse in origin, you also see kind of what some people have referred to as racial panics growing in the United States. And so that combined with an incarceration industry that, as you noted, in the United States was already the biggest in the world, but had kind of exhausted, in many ways, the people it could incarcerate. So kind of that industry looking for, more bodies to be able to incarcerate and make money off of. And so kind of these racial panics, along with a need to find scapegoats for economic recession in the U.S., all these forces kind of combine to all of a sudden make immigration detention look like the perfect solution and investment to a whole bunch of different groups of people. So I think an important point that we want to make in the book is that this is not just a Republican strategy. Detention has been popular throughout decades now. It has grown across decades as kind of a consistently popular political response to when people get upset about different things, we must detain more people, right? And so more politicians become invested in it, more the kind of the discourse around it, and popular discourse is like, we must detain these criminal immigrants in a way that justifies more and more detention. Then there are always plenty of companies out there ready to kind of step in and supply that detention space or the services needed in detention facilities. So it's just grown incrementally really since the 1980s in these very often abrupt ways. Like with Trump right now, we're seeing another very big expansion, but we've seen these expansions no matter the political party in power.
Yeah, it's really interesting to note how there's that kind of feels like a causal link or an inverse correlation, if you like, when, in the Obama era, the rates of incarceration in the criminal justice system slowed. You see that ramping up of detaining immigrants. So that was really interesting how it is this kind of issue around which there is bipartisan support. And there's, I guess, a number of law changes which you kind of highlight in the book as well from the 80s, which kind of effectively invent new reasons to detain immigrants as well. Could you give us like a quick sort of snapshot of some of these laws and what their consequences were, maybe?
We start seeing these laws starting in the 1980s, put into some of, kind of the anti-immigrant furor. You have provisions created categories of crimes. Like the first big one was the aggravated felony, right? Which initially it's only applied to anything committed by a migrant, right? And so when this category was first created, it really only applied to very serious things like murder and drug trafficking, but over the years, the category of aggravated felony has been expanded to include like very what for non-immigrants are very minor things, like perhaps shoplifting, or now like illegal entry or things like that. So if it's put on an immigrant, the law says they must be detained and deported. And it is very difficult to get out of that. So that's kind of one underlying force. But then through the years, you just see different provisions that make detention mandatory for more and more classes of immigrants, where our laws used to say like only people with criminal records would be detained. Now it's, women and children and asylum seekers. And so it pulls all these additional people into detention. And so the broader public sees people in detention, and you see, bars and wires, and it conjures up this idea of hardened criminals. But really the way our laws work, really kind of average people, like even, asylum seekers who are fighting for their life, often fleeing certain death where they're coming from. The laws now require them, in many cases, to be detained. And so we've seen, through the 80s and the 90s, post 9/11, there was kind of a fresh round of laws. And we just continuously see more and more laws that create reasons to detain people, and create laws around maintaining a certain detention capacity, right? So we have laws saying we must have this many detention beds available, and these laws have increasingly been interpreted to mean like they must be filled as well. So you're kind of creating the incentive to always be detaining people.
One of the things to add is we are seeing the same kinds of things happening, not just in the United States, but in countries all around the world as well. So, one of the things that we sort of end the book on is talking about how this is sort of a global phenomenon, or there's a need for a global campaign. And I know that we will talk about that further down the line. But, there's something about what the US is doing that becomes the model for other countries, and that is the same when it comes to the passing of laws around immigration and the criminalization of immigration. I think the other thing that then happens when migrants are criminalized for kind of activities that are not at all related to their immigration status and then detained is that we tend to mix the idea that migrants are criminals, and that's where we get crimmigration from, or the kind of assumption that migrants are all criminals, when it's actually, and in fact, detention is not for purposes of kind of criminal acts at all. It's a kind of a civil administrative process, not a criminal process, or not intended to be a criminal process. But as we show in the book, it is very much a kind of continuation of prison-like and carceral-like conditions that people experience in detention.
Mm. Yeah, and the fact that so many detention centres are also prisons or have been prisons, so the fact that the infrastructure is already carceral, it's pretty hard to argue that this is just some sort of administrative civic sort of process, as you suggest. And clearly detainment is being used as a form of deterrence, it seems. This kind of cruel, sort of highly punitive system is supposed to be a deterrent.
And I mean, you bring up a great point that we make in the book, that the idea that detention is an effective deterrent, it's a driving logic behind detention, right? Many politicians assume that it works to deter migration. And it's a popular way of justifying detention, right? Well, if we still have migration, we need more detention to deter it. And in fact, when you look in the long term, it is not an effective deterrent, right? The reasons driving people to migrate still exist. And so if you're not going to address those or pay attention to those reasons driving migration, even detention is not going to have any effect. So it's this false narrative, this false belief that is used to justify, one of the things used to justify the huge growth in our detention system.
Yeah, definitely. You note that the US detention system is made up of, well, I guess at the time it was like around 150 facilities dotted around the country. And you focus, I think, on 6 facilities in particular, and all of these are either based in New Jersey or New York. Could you say a little bit briefly about this choice? Are these facilities exemplary of that broader network? Why these 6, I guess?
There's a number of different reasons why we chose to focus on these 6 facilities. First of all, has to do with our own kind of regional location and kind of ease of access, which is a common decision-making process for anybody who's doing research. The other main driver of our decision about focusing on these facilities in particular is that they are representative of the different types of ownership or management structures that are in place for the running and operation of immigration detention facilities. So broadly, there are 3 different types of facilities. There are federally owned facilities. There are facilities that are owned or operated by private companies in their entirety. And there are facilities that are basically kind of rented or leased by local governments to the federal government, or for the purposes of detaining migrants for the federal government. And there are different contract types, and we talk about the different contract types that exist. And for the facilities that we research, there's a representation of each of those different types of ownership or management structures in our sample.
I would just add that while a lot of people think of detention facilities as on the border, on the U.S.-Mexico border, we really want to draw attention to the fact that these facilities are all over the United States. They're in Hawaii, they're in Puerto Rico, they're in Alaska. I mean, this is not just a border thing. These are facilities embedded around the country in urban and rural areas, creating this very huge system throughout the country.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of those dynamics of how detention is embedded in a particular, county or a particular state, that then becomes really interesting. I think you start the book with a question at some sort of town hall event, which someone asks, if I go to the zoo, is that zoo being funded by money that the county is getting from, an ICE facility? So there are all of these questions of how that embeddedness and, the complexity of the network works. And we'll come on to that, I'm sure. So one of the things that I think the book does really well is it sort of lays out quite nicely how bad care and appalling conditions inside these facilities, are not a mistake. They're not some sort of unintended outcome, but they're in fact baked into the business model. And it is a business model. This is a sort of highly lucrative industry. It's a requirement for profitability. And you don't touch on, I guess, every single aspect of the industry that supports and profits from immigration detention, but you do sort of devote several chapters to some of the key areas, which I guess are, food, sort of catering, medicine and healthcare, and the commissary. And all of these have a big direct impact on the day-to-day life of detainees. So it would be good to talk about how the sort of business model of detention affects each of these things in turn, and they're all interrelated, of course. So maybe we can start with food. Why is, corrections food, to use the sort of phrase, catering in the carceral industry, why is that both seen as a dependable and a sort of lucrative part of this larger industry, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, with food, imagine you're a huge food provider, and your customer or the people that you are serving the food to who are going to eat it are not actually your customer. So in carceral food industries and prison and detention centers, the people paying the food provider don't eat the food. and the detainees, the prisoners eating the food, they have very little recourse to complain about what they're eating. And so in the often volatile food industry, the hospitality industry, carceral facilities are incredibly stable, right? They're not going to fluctuate with weather, with different things that influence the hospitality industry. It's a very steady source of income, especially in the United States, where we are only detaining and incarcerating more people. So it means that it's a really cutthroat industry. So people who who want these detention center and prison contracts, they are incredibly competitive. Okay, so they put forward these different companies will compete for bids, and they have to meet the requirements laid out in a bid. So they'll get a contract based on cheapest bids, the cheapest offers. Well, we can feed detainees for, $1.25 a day. And so the people awarding the contracts, the facility operators, are like, great, we'll go with them. And there's no kind of motivation or little motivation by facility operators to check into that and say, well, can $1.25 actually feed the detainees enough quantity and edible food that it's meeting their basic needs? So the business model, as we talk about in the book, for food companies is really to get away with providing as little food as possible, right? And so they don't. So that means that detainees are often getting horribly insufficient quantities of food, but also often just disgusting food, right? There's very little quality control. There are stories throughout detention centers, throughout prisons, of food that is rotten. It has maggots. It's contaminated with all types of foodborne illnesses. They're getting things that are really just inedible, and there's very little that detainees can do about it. I mean, we talk about that some in the book. There are some systems in place, but they're very weak and ineffective. So, it really gives these food operators, the ones winning the contracts, license to just cut corners wherever they can to increase their profit.
At the same time that it's very clear that company providers are, doing the bare minimum to provide what they consider to be adequate food, and what the contract awarders, local governments or providers consider to be adequate food. It's important to say that for all intents and purposes, they are meeting standards and guidelines that they are provided with as terms for their contracts. So when service providers are called to account for what is clearly inadequate food, they say, but we have adhered to the guidelines that we are provided, whether that is caloric intake guidelines, whether that is kind of the scheduling of meal times guidelines. So they're really sort of pushing the limits of these guidelines, but they can categorically say that they are meeting guidelines, which is another part of what we tease out in the book, to make it clear that this is really a kind of a stitched up business, and many entities are involved in both sustaining it and ensuring that it keeps going.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely comes through. And just the last thing, I guess, on food here, it's interesting that on the one hand they can claim some degree of legitimacy by following the guidelines, but the contracts also kind of stipulate that the staff that work in these facilities will have different requirements in terms of what must be provided. So they know, it's kind of baked into the contract, they know that it's inadequate, because otherwise they wouldn't make that kind of a stipulation. So there's a clear double standard. The food is crap, they know it's crap, and they insist on it. Yeah. We'll move on maybe to medicine, because I guess similar to the food industry, you talk about how the institutionalization of medical neglect within immigration detention is also this big thing. And your findings on like access to medical care in the book are really damning. So could you outline some of the, the barriers that the system throws up for detainees who need medical care, because some of these barriers just seem absolutely absurd. And maybe, we can draw out some of the differentiation between, care needs relating to like chronic health issues, things that people might come in with, and then acute sort of medical health issues that might arise whilst they're in detention.
There are problems with carceral medical care from the moment that people come into the system. So this has to do with people who might come into detention or prisons with chronic conditions. Almost always their medicine and often medical devices are taken away from them, and it can be weeks before they're returned. And they may not be given, diabetes medication, heart medication, other type of medicines needed to care for chronic conditions. But there are also issues with kind of emergency or illness medical care. Detainees in facilities are supposed to be able to submit a request for medical care and within 24 to 48 hours get some type of response according to detainee handbooks, facility guidelines. Now, if you're experiencing an emergency, 24 hours is a really long time. But even these 24 to 48 guidelines are often not followed. There are many accounts in facilities around the system of detainee requests for medical care simply being ignored. Or if they are given some type of attention, a very common reply is drink more water, here's ibuprofen, right? There's very little kind of real care offered. If a detainee needs some type of off-site care, it is incredibly difficult to get that off-site care, whether it's for kind of a chronic condition, or even emergencies. That's why there's such a high number of deaths in detention, right? Because chronic conditions turn fatal. People will report symptoms that later turned out to be cancer or something like that, and they're ignored for months. So these types of responses and an inability to get outside care just create all types of medical disasters. There are big companies like WellPath, a huge medical care company that provides care. But you also see there's something called the ICE Public Health Service, which is supposed to be public health care that supposed to oversee all of the medical care in detention. They give permission for detainees to go off-site. They also operate with a cost containment approach. So all of these entities, even the supposedly public ones operating in detention, really aim to contain their costs, to provide as little care as possible, which, as you can imagine, has horrible health outcomes for detainees.
Yeah, I mean, it was really remarkable to read, I guess, in this chapter how, litigation has been weaponized in the carceral medical care industry, the outcome of which seems to be that effectively the lowest bid must always be awarded the contract, or else, they'll get sued, regardless of the quality of care that might be delivered. And I think you provide something which I thought was unbelievable. Like one of the major corporate providers of medical care in the industry, CCS, I'm not sure what that stands for, but CCS was sued nearly 1,400 times in federal court between 2008 and 2018 for charges of, negligence, inadequate care, denial of care, and cruel and unusual punishment. That's an almost incomprehensible statistic. It begs the question, if you were, a county or the local government or whatever the relevant local authority is, could you even provide decent medical care for detainees if you wanted to?
It's incredibly fraught, right? And CCS, which you note about all those lawsuits, is now WellPath, right, through a merger. So that company became a still existing company. It's not like all the lawsuits brought it down. So you have lawsuits about horrible care, medical negligence, But you also have, as you were referring to, all these lawsuits over contracts not won, right? So when counties are bidding out their healthcare contracts for facilities, for carceral and detention facilities, according to most state laws, they are required to give it to the lowest bidder. And so, as you note, counties that might say, well, this one company has a huge history of all these lawsuits about negligent care. We don't want to give it to them. Well, then that company doesn't get the contract and they take it to court. And so then the county has to spend often millions of dollars trying to justify why they didn't award to the lowest bidder. And they're kind of not allowed to pay attention to their medical history or look at the medical care that is received. So you can see from a county perspective, they might as well just go with the lowest bidder, because that's where it is likely the contract will likely end up going millions of dollars in legal bills later. So as you say, it's very difficult in this kind of bidding system for these different service contracts in the county facilities to provide decent medical care. The system works against it.
Maybe it'd be good to move on to one other sort of facet of sort of day-to-day life for detainees within this system, which is the kind of commissary / prison labor, essentially. As we've discussed, like the food provided is inadequate and sickening. And so I guess many people inside will try and supplement this by, buying food through the facility's commissary. So could you say a little bit more about sort of, what a commissary is, how it works, what kinds of things are purchasable, and, why that's such an important, lifeline, I guess, for many on the inside?
So commissaries are just like stores in a prison or in a detention facility, and they run on the basis that somebody can submit a request for something via email or via a kind of a kiosk of some kind within the facility, and within a kind of a day or a couple of days, then their request is fulfilled if the product is available. Now we've looked at quite extensive variety of items, of consumer items that are available, and it runs the gamut from snacks to what we might think of as kind of snack-like meals, like cup of noodles or things of that nature, to socks and underwear, to kind of recreational things like playing cards or things of that nature, right? So the kinds of things that are very ordinary that help you to occupy your time in a place where there isn't a great deal to do, or that help to keep you warm because what you're provided with isn't sufficient, or because laundry is not done on a regular basis, and you don't have clean underwear to wear, or things like that. To say nothing of the kinds of what we've been already talking about, which is sort of poor quality and inadequate amounts of food that people have. So very often people are really just driven to use the commissary as a way to supplement all facets of the day-to-day life in a detention facility. And what we have found, it's increasingly difficult to get records for both sales within a detention facility and what the cost of items are, so the price list for items in facilities. We have been able to do that for a couple of facilities, and what we have found when we compare, say, the price of a can of tuna, for example, in a facility in upstate New York, that the price tag for that is $2.85 for a tiny can, a portion-sized can of tuna. If you go to your local discount store, that same can of tuna, probably a name brand can of tuna, will cost you $1. So that's that's about 185% markup on the price. But because people are hungry, they have a need for things like this tuna. And so the next question is, where do they get money from? So some people who are detained have money, and that goes into an account for them. Some have family members who will send them money to their commissary or detention account. If people are adding money to a detainee's account, there is a charge for any money that they add. So there's another place where money is being extracted, or income or revenue is being extracted from detainees. Across the board, what we found is that prices in the commissary store are between 4 and 7 times higher than they are outside of detention facilities. So that's an important thing to realize. It's not just tuna; it's sort of across the board. If detainees don't have their own money, or if they don't have a family member or a network who can provide them with money, then the next option is for them to try to earn money while they are in a detention facility. So there are these things called voluntary work programs. It's questionable as to whether they're actually voluntary. In voluntary work programs, what detainees do is they do things like food preparation. They work in the library. Sometimes they work in the barber shop in the detention facility. So they do things that essentially help to keep the detention facility going, operating on a day-to-day basis. And for their participation in that, they're paid not $1 an hour, but $1 a day for that work, which is just an astounding extractive and exploitative wage for detainees. And so, what we tease out in the book is how this cycle of deprivation in terms of a lack of food and a lack of health care drives demand for a commissary. And when using the commissary, they are exploited in terms of the prices that detainees pay. And in order for them to even participate in that exploitative kind of cycle, they're further exploited by being laborers, or coerced laborers, as we describe it in the book.
Yeah, and I guess just a final thing to say on that as well, like, again, I talking about like the contracts of the people that, bid for the commissary, there's like often a stipulation, I think, in those contracts that the county will receive a certain commission on every sale. Not to mention the commission that's taken on money being put into the commissary account in the first place. And yeah, so the whole cycle of exploitation is pretty eye-opening. For listeners, there's this whole other section on sort of oversight, the standards, the process of inspections, accreditation as well. Again, one thing that I would draw out that I found particularly interesting in this is it's, all the stuff around the kind of essentially rubber stamping exercises that exist around inspections of facilities, the accreditation that facilities can sort of get to say that they're kind of providing exemplary, care or whatever. It's not just there to sort of protect the financial interests of the local government, the companies that are tendering for the contracts or running the facilities. It's actually another sort of parasitic industry in and of itself that also makes up part of Immigration Detention Inc. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say briefly about this subject before we maybe talk a little bit about what's been sort of happening more recently. But
you really encapsulate it there, right? So there's kind of this appearance of oversight with standards to be followed and inspections, as well as outside organizations that will accredit facilities. And very kind of cursory in most cases for the ICE ones. Very cursory inspections, kind of pay the accrediting agency the money and you will get your accreditation. And so it provides this illusion of oversight and proper care, while at the same time the contracted inspectors and the accrediting agencies and the people who work for them, they're all making money. It's kind of this profit machine, the oversight industry itself, right? So we look at it as kind of another way that money is extracted from this detention system. And these inspections and accreditations, they provide another aspect of the revolving door of personnel between government and private companies. So you very often see people working in ICE or something to do with detention, then immediately they move back and forth between that and private industry. So there's a lot of problematic relationships that we see through that oversight system as well as the others.
Yeah, I think, I was going to ask a question about, the example you give of John Kelly, the former DHS Secretary and Chief of Staff under the first Trump administration. His story seemed like a good one to share as an example of this kind of revolving door. You're talking about the highest levels between government and industry. Could you share that story very briefly?
Well, John Kelly, who in the first Trump administration was his defense secretary, but then chief of staff. But he, in his roles in the Trump administration, he designed and implemented a lot of the policies to do with child and family detention. And immediately after he left the Trump administration, he went and was employed on boards of many of those same private companies that were paid to detain children, to detain families. And so those links are incredibly clear. And right now, with the second Trump administration, there is just an explosion of those types of links. The current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has previously worked for prison corporations. People in ICE, there are lobbying links with Tom Homan, who is Trump's border czar. I mean, all of these have received detention industry money in the past, some very, very recently. Marco Rubio. I mean, these ties are just all over the place. So there are incredibly clear links between people currently making policies to detain more people and those companies who are seriously profiting off of those same policy shifts.
Well, maybe now's a good time to talk about Trump 2.0. In the afterword to the book, you describe, I think it's the first month of the new incoming presidency, as inflicting a sort of confused, chaotic and cruel onslaught of changing rules and shifting practices relating to immigration and border control. So it would be good to talk about how dramatically things have changed since you finished, writing the book and penning that sort of afterward in sort of January, February 2025. You also note that while the signals from the government at the time were incredibly alarming, it wasn't maybe yet wholly possible to determine what was rhetoric and posturing about being, tough on immigration and what was the reality, in terms of policy changes, immigration crackdown through like ICE raids and so on, and their lasting impact. So how much clearer is the picture now? What have we seen sort of happening over the last, 6 months or 5 months? Yeah.
It's a great question, and I think it's a question that that everyone is still trying to grapple with. And I think one of the things that's very clear about the strategy, if we want to call it a strategy, is that kind of chaos and cruelty are core elements of immigration enforcement. What has kind of shifted perhaps a little bit from the time that we paused really in terms of writing the afterword for the book is that at that time, a month into the administration, the detention system was not at capacity, whereas currently it is at capacity. And so part of what we're currently seeing is efforts to try to manage that situation, and some competing voices, I think, around how to grapple with both the campaign promise of deporting so-called illegal migrants and kind of upping quotas, and the not infinite capacity of the immigration detention system.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we were seeing, especially in that first month, is that it was clear that the second Trump administration wanted it to look like they were going all out and detention and deportation numbers were up, when in reality at that time they were pretty similar to what Biden had been doing, which was already significant, right? Biden had gotten detention and deportation numbers up higher than Trump had in his first administration. So the Trump administration was employing a lot of media smokescreen tactics, re-releasing old ICE bulletins about raids from a decade ago. So kind of flooding Google searches so that if anybody did internet searches, it immediately looked like there was tons of things going on. I think those kind of tactics remain, but we are, as Deirdre said, really seeing increases in detention. We are seeing increases in deportation, but really not as much as you would think from the news, because there's almost nobody coming across the border now. There aren't those, for lack of a better word, easy numbers to detain and deport. So to maintain the numbers of those that are being detained and deported, the Trump administration is looking deep in the country's interior. We're seeing, as we're seeing in the news, there are these raids of work sites on the street, medical facilities, courthouses. They are going to really kind of these spaces that have not been touched, that have been considered kind of off limits from ICE. They are now fully on within the limits of the Trump administration. So the maintenance of these numbers it's always been destructive, but it is incredibly destructive. They're going into kind of the intimate spaces of community life and homes. So to maintain those numbers that they are, they have to employ these just deeply cruel tactics. And so I think we're seeing a real willingness to undertake those tactics that we weren't quite certain if they'd act on those, because it involves really doing things that are kind of unimaginably horrible to families, to communities, to children. They are making them real. They're really showing a willingness to follow those tactics.
And then to address the problem of the limit that is the detention system's capacity, we're seeing a further kind of laying out of agreements between local law enforcement or local kind of criminal holding facilities and immigration enforcement authorities. That's one piece of it, but also a promise that those facilities don't have to meet the standards that are, as we've already described, are already really quite minimal, as a way to sort of open up capacity for more people to be detained in facilities that were not part of the detention system previously.
And I would just add, in the Trump's one big beautiful bill that passed the House and is now being debated in the Senate, it contains $45 billion to supersize the detention system. In 2024, $3.4 billion was paid per year for 41,000 beds. Just imagine what they're going to do with $45 billion. They're going to, get the detention capacity up over 100,000, the creation of hundreds of new facilities. And I think a huge danger that we see is our detention system has never gotten smaller. So once you build out this facility, you have all of these companies and communities that become dependent on this money. So you're asking to put into place this detention machine that needs feeding, right? Because of all these financial dependencies that are created. So I think everyone looking at detention and deportation, we are at a really critical point right now, because the threat is real of creating an even more massive, kind of violent, disruptive system that is just going to want to detain and deport more people to keep going.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about you noted that deportations weren't going up as much, but one thing you reference in the afterword, in which I've seen articles about again recently, is the question of whether they might start deporting undocumented migrants to Guantanamo. I saw an article suggesting that maybe as many as 9,000 people are currently being vetted for transfer, with those first transfers to begin sort of imminently. And I guess the semiotics of this are really deeply chilling, because everyone that remembers the war on terror remembers the grave injustices that detainees faced there over a long, long period, many years. So what is the latest on that? Is that likely to happen?
That's what we've heard as well, that they're vetting people to see if they're healthy enough to go to Guantanamo, which in itself is chilling to think about. Why would you need to be healthy enough to go to Guantanamo? But Guantanamo currently only has the space for several hundred detainees. So when they're talking about 9,000, they're talking about massive tent camps of people. And they're doing that to create more capacity. We're currently at over 51,000 in detention, when the bed capacity is technically 41,000. So, they want to create more capacity to be able to detain more migrants. And by moving people to places like Guantanamo, as with sending them to El Salvador, that's out of the kind of ability of any normal oversight, regular oversight mechanisms, as weak as they are. So you're really kind of pulling people out of our already weak ability to try to get any type of control of standards. So, pulling people out to like Guantanamo is making the detention system bigger, but it's also kind of putting people in a black box of rights and conditions.
One of the things that kind of put a dampener on Guantanamo when it was first used in Trump 2.0 was the massive costs associated with sending people to Guantanamo. And so I think, in terms of, things to watch, with the ongoing or repeated use of Guantanamo, is how cost is going to be managed for it as a site for detention. That's not clear, or at least until the big beautiful bill gets passed into law. It's not clear how that site is going to be paid for.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about resisting and dismantling Immigration Detention Inc. to conclude. I mean, I saw in terms of like resistance from detainees themselves, one thing that comes through in the book is that hunger strike is often a tool, perhaps one of the only tools at the sort of collective disposal of detainees to sort of protest their conditions. But more recently, I also saw an article at I think it was Delaney Hall Detention Center in New Jersey. There was a sort of jailbreak there following, days of unrest. Detainees actually pushed down one of the facility's outer walls in protest against terrible conditions, lack of food in particular. I think 4 people escaped. So there's clearly, resistance from the inside, and we're also seeing a huge degree of resistance on the outside. Obviously, in California, the National Guard and then I think the Marines were even deployed to sort of quell sort of people's protesting in the street against the extent of immigration raids. Yeah, so it would be good to talk about some of this stuff, because it is daunting when you think about like how to dismantle what is, as you point out in the book, throughout the book, this massive, complicated system of both intertwined ideologies, propping up white supremacist sort of ideologies, and also these kind of economic dependencies. But clearly, like, dismantling it is crucial. So, I guess one thing that was in my mind when I was reading the book is around the question of reform, because, a lot of listeners probably will be thinking that, ultimately what needs to happen, and I'm sure you agree with this, is that the system needs to be just abolished completely, and perhaps borders themselves. But, when you're talking about the failings of things like the inspections and accreditation process, the inadequacy of like guidelines, obviously it'd be better if they were more meaningful and robust, but you also don't want positive reforms that end up buttressing the system, giving it that veneer of legitimacy.
You don't want to build a better, more permanent system.
Precisely. So, so I would love to hear your perspectives on, how you think we can approach this like big question of dismantling immigration detention. I guess with all of that in mind. Yeah.
I think that, as we said at the outset of our conversation with you, Chris, one of the things that is a goal of our writing this book is to raise awareness about just how deplorable the system is. And so as a strategy, as a technique, I think that we're hopeful that that is what we will accomplish. and at the same time, part of an ongoing campaign has to be to expose repeatedly the kinds of injustices that we see in the immigration detention system. There are some, I think, obvious ways in which exposing the political economy of immigration detention leads us to think about solutions or ways to sort of address the problem. And one is, if we know who's involved, then we can campaign against those very companies. We can kind of divest from or not do business with those companies. And I think that is a pretty effective strategy, or can be a pretty effective strategy, as an addendum to many other things that people are doing, such as protesting in the streets. Another thing that we also identify as problematic, and therefore something that there's a need for awareness of and also to campaign against, is that what we have seen previously is that when there is successful legislation at state level to end detention contracts, one of the things that has happened is that rather than detainees being released from detention, they are moved to another state where it's more remote, or where they don't have access to lawyers, or they don't have access to their family or support networks. So we talk about the dangers of leapfrogging from state to state. And that, I think, is one of the things that we want to highlight as part of a campaign against detention, that it isn't enough to say end detention in state A or in state B, but it has to be sort of a national campaign as well as an international and a global campaign.
I mean, I think drawing attention to particular businesses who make money off of detention is a huge thing. I think making people, like individual voters, make your voice known, your opinion known to elected representatives. Be vocal about this issue. Demand that you do not adapt your local jails to become detention centers. Do not appropriate more money for detention. It is popular with Democrats and Republicans, right? It's something they all have a hard time saying no to. But make it known that you don't want these things. As you said, we don't want to just say, make, better inspections, make better oversight. But if you do insist on decent standards and enforcing them, you greatly reduce the profit from detention. If you require that any detainees laboring in detention are paid a minimum wage, that immediately makes detention way less profitable for facility operators. So, I think key ways to chip away at detention are removing profit incentives, and that's around detention, but also businesses that fund and invest in, make money on detention in other ways, right? So through boycotts and other things. So just going after the ability for people to make profit on detention in any way is a key strategy.
Well, Nancy, Deirdre, I think that's probably a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me on the show today. I thought it was an excellent book. It's clearly incredibly timely, and this conversation's been really sort of informative as well. So once again, for listeners, the book's called Immigration Detention Inc, The Big Business of Locking Up Migrants. It's out now from Pluto Press, or it will be out now by the time this airs. So thank you both once again. Really appreciate your time. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thanks so much, Chris.
That was Nancy Hiemstra and Deirdre Conlon on Radicals and Conversation. Once again, the new book, Immigration Detention Inc, The Big Business of Locking Up Migrants, is out now, and podcast listeners can get 40% off through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. If you like the show, then please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We'll be back with our next episode in just a couple of weeks' time, in which I'll be talking to Alana Lenton about her excellent new book, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. So stay tuned for that one. Until then, thanks for watching, and goodbye.